We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years, since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the darkened hour.
Welcome to another episode of the Darkened Hour. I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald, and with me today is Julie Sears. Sears was a former military analyst focusing on Central and South Asia for the Defense Intelligence Agency, as well as being a confidant to the late co-leader of the Northern Alliance, Ahmad Shah Massoud. She's currently working at Boone Karlberg, a law firm based in Montana. I thank you very much for coming on, Julie.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So let's make it simple. The first question: how'd you get started with the Defense Intelligence Agency?
Yeah, so I've been really interested in international politics starting from when I was a teenager. I was interested in joining one of the many intelligence agencies that we had even back then in the 90s. And when I graduated from college, which was in 1992, that was the end of the Cold War. So there was a lot of restructuring going on. It took me a little while before I could get hired somewhere, but eventually D.I.A. hired me in 95. I think more because of some of the study I had done of Persian, Farsi and Dari, than the Russian skills that I graduated from college with. But yeah, eventually they hired me and I became an intelligence officer was my title. I was primarily an analyst, but I would do some travel to the region and get some firsthand experiences. And that's what I did with D.I.A.
How did you become situated in Afghanistan, and why did this country so interest you so much?
Yeah, it predated my time at D.I.A. Like I said, as a teenager, I was really interested in world affairs. I followed closely the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I was very impressed when the Afghans ousted the Red Army, and with the downfall of the Soviet Union not long after that, and their role in contributing to that. So I was really interested in Afghanistan. I greatly admired those Afghans who had fought against the Soviets and then tried to create a government afterwards. And then by the time I was at D.I.A., the Taliban had come onto the scene and already were showing signs of the same excesses that they have now, and in terms of their repression of women and minorities, and a lot of their extremism. And some of these same former Afghan mujahideen were now fighting the Taliban. So I was still interested in that conflict and really wanted to get into Afghanistan to meet with some of them.
There is there's very little is known about the Defense Intelligence Agency. Why does it attract less attention than, say, the C.I.A.?
Well, I think it's a smaller organization. It's grown larger after 9/11, but I think still compared to the C.I.A., it's relatively small. It's kind of an interesting mix of, especially when I was there were some active duty military, a lot of civilian analysts who were former military, and then some individuals like myself who didn't have any military experience. So we were, kind of an interesting mix, I guess. And I suspect D.I.A. does not have the sort of PR department that the C.I.A. seems to have that gets them in the news, sometimes good, sometimes bad, I guess. But I think sometimes they try to shape the stories. I think the C.I.A. has a good relationship with a number of journalists and helps drive certain narratives, but D.I.A. doesn't seem to be as involved in that sort of thing, and seems more content to kind of fly under the radar.
Now, let's get to the meat of the questions. So the CIA was undergoing internal changes, which allowed for them to focus more so on bin Laden in the mid-1990s, but got rid of many of the middle management field officers, which was a complaint within the CIA. Was the D.I.A. undergoing similar changes at this time?
The D.I.A. at that time in the 90s was going through a number of structural changes, kind of trying to figure out its place in the post-Cold War world. It went through a number of reorganizations. I would say probably less focused, though, or less specific to the perceived threat from bin Laden himself, but I think aware of the threat of terrorism, especially from Islamist extremists. But I don't think it was driven by that. It was more just trying to do sort of a post-Cold War makeover and figure out what would make sense.
When the Taliban came into power in 1996, what was the stance at the D.I.A. regarding Afghanistan at this point?
Yeah, I think Afghanistan was regarded by most at D.I.A. and I would say the other intelligence agencies as well as still sort of a backwater. Bin Laden himself was the focus of some attention, but in terms of how he'd fit into what most regarded as a civil war in Afghanistan, there wasn't a lot of attention to that. There wasn't a lot of interest in who the players still were in Afghanistan. So yeah, I would say there wasn't a whole lot of interest. I wouldn't say there was an official position, though. I think there were a few individuals. I think there were some lobbyists in DC who were trying to make the Taliban look a little better than they were, in the hopes that they could push this line that now Afghanistan will be stable. It's open for investment, particularly energy investment. I think that line was being pushed, but I think a lot of people in the intelligence agencies sort of took a wait and see attitude.
When did you first meet with Ahmad Shah Massoud, by the way?
So that would have been in, I guess, 1998. That was my second trip into Afghanistan. The first trip was in Taliban areas, so I wasn't able to meet him then. But yeah, so 1998, October 1998 was when I made the first trip into the areas that were controlled by Massoud's forces.
Just a follow-up to that, what was your overall assessment of the man?
I was very impressed. He had quite the reputation that preceded him, and I would say he lived up to it. It was really amazing all that he had accomplished against the Soviet Union, and then in the very difficult efforts to try to form a government in that sort of interim period, and then to be sort of the last one standing, fighting against the Taliban and trying to keep up the morale of his forces and kind of hold the line against this even newer version of Islamic extremism that was represented by the Taliban and bin Laden. He was very remarkable.
Well, speaking of bin Laden arrives in Afghanistan in 1996 when he is forced to lead the Sudan. Were there any reports by the Defense Intelligence Agency regarding bin Laden at this point in time? And did the intelligence community share any data with you regarding his profile?
There was collegiality among analysts to some extent. Afghanistan, like I said, itself wasn't a very high priority, and that was kind of what I was interested in even more than kind of bin Laden himself as a counter-terrorist threat. But I know I wrote a bit on it, on how bin Laden's arrival might impact the Afghan forces fighting inside Afghanistan, Massoud and the Taliban in particular, and what it could mean for the Taliban to embrace him, which they showed early signs of doing, and they consistently did so afterwards. So I think bin Laden, though, as a topic, even from a counter-terrorist perspective, tended to be somewhat divorced from his Afghan context, was my sense from my time in the intelligence community.
Did they consider him a threat at all at this point?
He was considered a threat. He had been implicated in the, I think it was 1993 attempt to bomb the World Trade Center. Right. And then certainly by the time that I went to Afghanistan in 98, that was shortly after the the embassy bombings in Africa that were well coordinated and very devastating. So I think he was regarded as a threat.
Okay, Unocal, which is the Union Oil Company of California, and Unocal Corporation made a tentative deal with the Taliban to build a $4.5 billion pipeline network to transport Caspian Sea oil and gas across Afghanistan to the Indian subcontinent. But the plan was scrapped when the Clinton administration bombed suspected al-Qaeda training camps in the country. Massoud had suspected Unocal was financing the Taliban. So this is a two-part question. How did this deal materialize, and did Unocal fund the Taliban to capture the country's capital, Kabul?
That is, like you said, something that Massoud said, and I think he based that opinion on solid intelligence that he had. I never saw the, specifically what the intelligence was, or asked him specifically how. My understanding is he had a good network of individuals, basically informers who would tell him things, and that would have been true from the period of the 1980s. So I don't really have any reason to doubt his sources, but he seemed very convinced, I think, from multiple sources that Unocal was spreading money around that helped the Taliban advance on Kabul and elsewhere in the country in that lead up. So my professional opinion would be that he was correct in that. And certainly Unocal was spreading a lot of money around Washington around the same time, so it would make sense.
Yeah, if you could assess approximately how much you think they were.
In Afghanistan, it might not have taken a lot. Probably $1 million or less, I think, would have made a big difference to convince people to flip sides or just walk away, which is my understanding of what happened and why the Taliban were able to advance so quickly.
Right, and it's funny that you bring up switch sides. In other words, I want to follow this up because the Afghans are notorious for flipping sides when the money is right. Some of them have that reputation. That is true. Yes. You came into pertinent information from captured al-Qaeda operatives that Ariana Airlines was funneling drugs and money to the Taliban. This is a remarkable story. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, it was really from a variety of sources. I don't remember specifically which ones, but it was even after I had left D.I.A, so I feel comfortable talking about it because it wasn't classified, at least when I learned of it. But right. Yeah, that there was kind of this network of foreign outside arms and fighters to some extent that would come into Afghanistan, and then the flights would leave loaded up with opium or various degrees of processed heroin, and go to usually the UAE and back was where the air bridge seemed to be from, and then money or other supplies that the Taliban needed would come in on those flights too.
What was the Gulf behind that as well?
It's always a little hard to know. There are a lot of very wealthy individuals in the Gulf. Some of them probably do that as more of that being support for the Taliban, probably are involved as a result of their own private beliefs. But at the time, there were only 3 governments that recognized the Taliban, and that was Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. So right. I don't think it's a big coincidence that UAE was very crucial in forming that air bridge. And of course, Pakistan played its very direct role in providing safe haven to the Taliban, and as well as a substantial source of fighters.
When you talk about Pakistan, we're talking about the ISI?
Yes, I would say, even beyond the ISI, there was just a very robust network in Pakistan from madrasas and various operatives to even the regular Pakistani military that seemed to send in individuals to help out the Taliban at key points and to basically be embedded with them, often either on the battlefield or I think to some extent even with some of their government functions.
Right, because this is important because another follow-up is that the Taliban are from Pakistan. Mullah Omar is from Pakistan. Most of the Taliban fighters that came in to Afghanistan during the Soviet Union came from the madrasas in Islamabad and Peshawar. It is reported that the Saudi head of the GID, Prince Turki bin Faisal, had met with the high-ranking Taliban leadership, specifically Mullah Omar, and wished for him to relinquish bin Laden to the kingdom or the Americans so they could prosecute him, but the Taliban refused this offer. If you are aware of this proposal, can you speak on this a little more?
Yeah, I'm not directly aware of it. I've certainly heard that and don't have any reason to say that that's not true. I think, kind of like I was saying earlier, it's hard to sort of sort out who's doing what in any given country and what's government policy or not. I think it's certainly feasible that if there were someone trying to work with the United States on that, it would be someone like Prince Turki, with whom the US had a long relationship. But I suspect there were others who supported the Taliban in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere that would have convinced the Taliban to make it worth their while to not turn him over. So, yeah, but that story is highly plausible and I think is generally accepted as very likely true now.
Right. Now, I'll just get your opinion to follow up on that. The excuses were that the Taliban were following old Pashtun laws that even predate Islam. That's the reason why they didn't hand over bin Laden. And also, too, was that if they did hand over bin Laden to the West or to Israel, it would have a negative effect from the Muslim world itself, and they would condemn the Taliban. Would you agree with something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was ever any idea that they would turn over bin Laden to Israel. Curiously enough, he never targeted Israel. It was usually Saudi Arabia or
right.
The US in the Gulf. But even, I think you're right that within the Muslim world and his natural allies, the Taliban would not look good if they turned him over, but there would probably be some face-saving things they could do to make that a little easier. I don't believe their excuse that it was some sort of pushed in hospitality was for the reason that they weren't turning him over. They certainly, at times to guests, if they didn't like him, they'd throw him out of helicopters or kill them. Or they could be very selective in exercising that hospitality. I think it was much more a shared extremist vision and the genuine help that bin Laden gave them. I think they were closely allied ideologically so that the Taliban did not want to turn him over.
Right, and he also served, that's a great point that you raised. He also served as a money financier as well. So I guess the Taliban, much like in the way of the Sudan of the Hassan al-Turabi of the National Islamic Front, where they, scavenged any type of money. I think bin Laden spent like over $70 million in the Sudan, and then he was expelled. He was pretty angry about that as well. So you meet with Massoud in August of '98. What was the nature of this meeting, and were the D.I.A. as split as the C.I.A. regarding Massoud?
Well, so it was October '98, and it wasn't. I wouldn't say it was widely known within D.I.A. that I was going over there. I think, and this was more reflective of how the U.S. regarded Afghanistan at the time. Somewhat surprisingly, in retrospect, it wasn't a country that someone with a security clearance was forbidden from going to, and was, even a place potentially you could put an official trip together. It's kind of for boring bureaucratic reasons that I think that it wasn't better known that I was going, but again, partly that was because it was, a place that analysts could travel to, whether on their own time or to some extent on their official time, even though that was very rare at the time. So I think within D.I.A. and the individuals who knew I was going, I think they, like myself, viewed it as a good opportunity to get information. I think the political ramifications were at a higher level and probably less from D.I.A. I think C.I.A. ended up being somewhat neutral. The individuals who were involved with Afghanistan at the State Department at that time seemed to be particularly upset about the message that it might send. We were trying to be, I think, neutral in the war between Massoud and the Taliban. The State Department didn't see the need to try to get additional information on that issue. So, but yeah, I think maybe as you described some of the differences of opinions within other agencies, it led to, I think, maybe some surprise when others learned about the trip, but not a particularly strong reaction, to my knowledge, from any entity other than agency other than the State Department.
This is the question that really kills me, because if he just had a little bit more, because he goes to the United Nations, I think, United Nations Security Council, and he argues for help from the global community about trying to fight against the Taliban. And the CIA basically just almost stood out of it. And if he just had the help, maybe, do you think he could have taken over and beaten the Taliban if he got the help?
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly what he wanted in 1998 and onward. And I would say even before that too, he realized, even when I think many Americans didn't, even Americans who were focused on this issue, he realized that the Taliban were essentially an enemy of the United States, that they were ideologically allied with bin Laden, that having them have a safe haven for bin Laden just let al-Qaeda plot and plan against the United States. And he was very much perceived as an enemy by both the Taliban and bin Laden too. So in other words, like during the period of shared interests when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, he saw this as a similar instance when we could band together and give his forces some support, mainly just money. I mean, I don't think he ever contemplated or would have wanted any actual US forces in Afghanistan. But even diplomatic support, like I said, only 3 countries recognized the Taliban. Pretty much the entire rest of the world recognized the government of which Massoud was a part. But the US did not recognize that government. It was led nominally by Burhanuddin Rabbani, and then Massoud was more the political leader. Even just giving diplomatic support would have been a powerful signal, and then providing some financial support certainly would have been helpful too. And to answer your question, I do think if he had that, especially earlier on, like we were talking about earlier, even just relatively small amounts of money in Afghanistan combined with some momentum can cause a pretty dramatic shift in the on-the-ground situation. So yes, I think he could have, it would have taken an alliance with a number of others in Afghanistan, but yes, I think he could have pushed out the Taliban.
Okay, you returned from Afghanistan, and suddenly you are met with criticisms and then a suspension from the D.I.A, even though you had the clearance to travel to Afghanistan. Talk about what happened to you and why were you met with such hostility from upper management from D.I.A?
Yeah, I think it was because upper management at D.I.A didn't realize I had gone. When they became aware of it, which was from an outside agency, I think it was the State Department. I think initially they denied it that I had clearance to go at least. And then when they found that I had, I think that embarrassed them and they became even more upset. I don't know that they really got into the politics of it so much as that, they certainly didn't see any benefit to it, which is what I disputed it at the time and would still now. We didn't have a lot of information about Afghanistan. That was part of what motivated me to go. And I did think that the information that I brought back, I found it very important as an analyst and very relevant, but they didn't seem to be interested in that. And my understanding, especially since that time, talking to others who weren't involved at the time, even in individuals with the CIA, for example, really just had a very narrow focus on trying to get information solely about bin Laden. We're told really to avoid or ignore some of the larger implications of the Taliban and Massoud's fight, and how bin Laden was manipulating that, really siding with the Taliban, and how there was a lot more going on, and that what otherwise appeared to be a civil war, the involvement of Pakistan, for example, that there was a lot more going on in Afghanistan at the time than simply that bin Laden had sought refuge there.
It seemed the upper levels of management, the State Department, the CIA, and the D.I.A. were almost protective of the Taliban regarding your data collection, which you amassed from the country in the 2 weeks while you were there. Do you think this was the case?
I think there definitely were some individuals who would have preferred that the Taliban just take over the country, not have to focus on, like you said, the potential that Massoud was there, that he could be aided, that he could fight the Taliban. There were a number of people who didn't want to get involved with that. Like I said, around that time, which was 98, 99, Unical was still hoping that they could, burnish the Taliban's image somewhat, and come back from what was so far their failed effort to get that pipeline in place. I think there were still individuals who were supportive of those efforts, even though they were, like you said, largely put on ice after the 1998 US missile strikes against the Taliban or certain Taliban areas.
Had the CIA and the D.I.A. backed Massoud? Oh, I actually have a question. What? Let me ask you another one. What would you think have happened to bin Laden and Al Qaeda if the Taliban had been defeated?
I think they would have gone to Pakistan, like they did post 9/11. But bin Laden obviously has some friends there and some powerful protection where he was able to remain. I don't know what other ties he might have had in other countries around that time that might have been an alternative, but I would say certainly Pakistan was probably certainly the logical place for him to seek refuge, which is eventually what he did.
2 days before September 11, 2001, Massoud is assassinated, and he's assassinated by 2 Al Qaeda operatives posing as media, where a camera they were using had a planted bomb inside of it that exploded, and he was killed. What were your thoughts when this happened?
When I heard he was assassinated, I did assume that it was bin Laden. When I met with him, as early as 1998, and then the several times I met with him after that, he knew that bin Laden was trying to kill him. So that wasn't a surprise. After that, I guess my next thought was concern of how the resistance against the Taliban would be able to continue with Massoud's death, because he really was the glue, I think, that held them together. He was the most inspirational figure and very much a natural leader. So that was my concern after that, was what was going to happen to those areas of Afghanistan that were free of the Taliban, the people living there, what would happen to them, and then just the whole concept of resistance, how would it be able to continue in his absence?
All right, fast forward to the present day Afghanistan. The Taliban are back. It seems they've taken control of the country now. Is this a different Taliban from the Taliban you saw in the early 90s?
I don't think so. I think they might be a little more media savvy now, but I think they're still just as repressive. I think they are still a threat. I don't know what the ability of the Afghans will be to organize a resistance to them. I think eventually that will grow. I'm not sure in what form, but the Afghans do have a strong history of mobilizing to forces that are repressive. And I think the Taliban in many ways, to many Afghans at least, still seem like a foreign-backed force. The foreigners in this case being Pakistan. I think many Afghans still bristle at that and don't trust the Taliban, don't like them. I'm not sure, like I said, how long it will take to for that to be organized. Obviously, there are some elements, including some individuals who were around Ahmad Shah Massoud and his own son when the Taliban were first around. But I think I think that resistance will eventually organize and grow.
Do you think the United States made a mistake by pulling out without having, without allowing just the Taliban to take over the country completely so quickly?
You know, we had been there for 20 years. I think the mistakes that we made were probably made early on in that 20-year period, trying to create an army that looked like an army we would recognize, as opposed to an army that would be a better fit for Afghanistan, that would rely more on locals. You know, the fact that a lot of those Afghan soldiers didn't seem to have been paid for very long and were therefore relatively easy for the Taliban to manipulate. I think by the time we had drawn down our forces to what they were this year, and you know, a number of the Taliban had been released, I think it would have been difficult to come back from that deal that was made under the prior administration. And you know, I think 20 years for most Americans was more than enough. Like I said, it's certainly never something that Massoud would have wanted or even contemplated. I think we would have been better off from the beginning, identifying Afghans that we could rely on and trust to form a more genuinely organic Afghan organization and government. And I hope we'll support whatever resistance eventually gets organized, because I think that will be genuinely Afghan, and we could play a helpful role with that. But I don't think having U.S. forces there is good for Americans or really in the long run good for Afghans either.
Just another question on that. Is that because it just seems that this would be like a reciprocating problem with Afghanistan, that will always have an involvement at some level, keeping the Taliban alive, because they're in full force. It's shocking. Do you think Al-Qaeda will make a rebound while this is happening?
You know, Al-Qaeda's been through a lot in the last 20 years. It's interesting to see that the Taliban seem to like I said, I think the Taliban are just as extreme and bad as they were before, but they seem to be dealing now with an even more extremist terrorist group in terms of ISIS. So that is a very interesting and different development that potentially we could maybe even use to our advantage. I think as long as the Taliban are off balance, I think they would be reluctant to make, at least consciously, Afghanistan the sort of safe haven that it was for bin Laden in the 1990s leading up to 2001. I think they're going to have their hands full trying to govern, and it's, again, not because I think they're ideologically any better, but they're dealing with their own rivalries and challenges now that I think in some ways would make that more difficult. And of course, you know, leading up to this year and for many years, the Taliban have had areas of Afghanistan that they controlled, and they did not seem to, you know, quickly make that into a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, for example, even when they've had the chance for a few years now. So I think that dynamic is a little different now, but it's certainly worth keeping an eye on and seeing what other extremist threats might arise from Afghanistan. But that's been going on for a number of years already.
Well, you're talking about the Islamic State in Khorasan that's fighting with the Taliban at the current right.
Yes.
My last question to you, Julie. You know, me and Richard Cox, we were talking, and he brought up an interesting point. You were very young when you went to Afghanistan. It's almost shocking because you look like you were about 22 in the old picture, and you're very young right now. So we were asking you, how old were you when you first went to Afghanistan?
Oh, thanks for the compliment, I guess. No, I was, so the first time I went to Afghanistan was in 1997. I was 27 years old. So I was relatively young, a little older than 22 though.
Were you one of the youngest analysts at the D.I.A. at the point?
I think so. Probably yes. Yeah. Yeah, it was, there weren't a lot of analysts there who didn't have some prior military experience. They were just starting to bring people like myself in. So yeah, I was one of the youngest, that's for sure.
Well, listen, that I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and answering these questions. Julie, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.